For 20 years, he lived by one unbreakable rule: no touching women. Not a handshake, not an accidental brush. Nothing. Ryan Lancaster, the cold and untouchable millionaire CEO of Horizon Capital, had built an empire on control, precision, and distance. No one dared to question his peculiar rule. Until now. Because today, everything is about to change. He has just hired a new assistant, Emma Sullivan, smart, fearless, and completely unaware of his golden rule. And in less than 24 hours, she's going to do the unthinkable. What happens when an immovable force meets an unstoppable woman? Ryan Lancaster is about to learn that some rules were made to be broken. Horizon Capital was not just a company. It was an ecosystem, one meticulously crafted, where every piece fit into place with machine-like efficiency. The office operated under strict discipline, a world where silence was not just golden. It was law. The employees moved with a quiet purpose, their voices hushed, their footsteps light. There was no room for chaos here, no space for unpredictability. Every meeting, every email, every breath was calculated, carefully woven into the fabric of an empire built on precision. But today, something was off, a shift in the air. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there, a subtle tremor rippling beneath the polished surface of order. It moved in the way people lingered at their desks a second too long, eyes flickering toward the entrance. In the way fingers hesitated over keyboards, conversations trailed off mid-sentence. It was in the way anticipation coiled in the air, heavy, expectant, because someone new had arrived. She was different. Emma Sullivan stepped through the revolving doors, her presence slicing through the unspoken tension like a blade. The rhythmic click of her heels echoed against the marble floors, each step steady, unhurried, confident. She didn't shrink under the weight of curious glances. She didn't waver beneath the scrutinizing eyes that followed her from every corner of the expansive lobby. She walked with purpose, not arrogance, but certainty. She was here to do a job. And yet she had no idea about the storm she had just stepped into, no idea about the rule. The whispers started before she even reached the reception desk. Is that her? She doesn't know. She should have been warned. The tension thickened. Eyes darted toward the executive floor, the place few dared to look directly, the domain of a man who wielded power with an iron grip. Ryan Lancaster, a name spoken with respect, fear, and just the slightest touch of intrigue. A man who had built this empire from the ground up. A man who had everything. Money, influence, absolute control. And yet, there was one thing he refused. One rule so absolute, so unshakable, that no one had dared to question it in 20 years. No touching, not a handshake, not an accidental brush of fingers, not even the faintest contact between fabric and skin. No one knew why. Theories had circulated for years, each more elaborate than the last. Some whispered about a betrayal, a woman who had shattered him so completely that he had built walls no one could break through. Others speculated about something deeper, darker, a wound buried too far beneath the surface for anyone to reach. But the truth, no one knew. No one dared to know. Because the few who had broken the rule, whether by accident or ignorance, had not lasted long at Horizon Capital. And Emma Sullivan? She had no idea. As she walked toward the elevators, she felt it, the weight of something she couldn't quite place. She wasn't a stranger to scrutiny. She had been in high-powered environments before. She knew what it was like to walk into a room full of people who had already decided whether or not she belonged. But this was different. This wasn't the usual assessment of a new hire. This was something else, something unspoken, something personal. She could feel it pressing against her skin, invisible but tangible, like the static in the air before a storm. But Emma wasn't the type to shrink under pressure. She kept walking. She pressed the button for the executive floor, stepping into the mirrored elevator without hesitation. As the doors slid shut, she caught a glimpse of her own reflection. Composed, unreadable, every inch the professional she had worked to become. Behind her, the whispers grew louder. She doesn't know. She's walking right into it. This is going to be a disaster. The elevator doors closed, and just like that, it began. Because soon, Ryan Lancaster would find out. And the one rule that had never been broken was about to shatter. Emma Sullivan was not easily fazed. She had worked with high-powered executives before, men who wielded wealth and influence like weapons, men who expected obedience, efficiency, and perfection. She had learned to navigate their temperaments, anticipate their needs before they even voiced them. Nothing about the corporate world surprised her anymore, or so she thought. The task seemed simple enough. Bring a tie to the CEO's office before his meeting. A small, mundane errand, one she hadn't even hesitated to take on. She had arrived early that morning, ready to prove herself in her new role, eager to meet the challenges that came with working for one of the most notoriously demanding executives in the industry. Ryan Lancaster. Even the name carried weight within Horizon Capital. A man whose presence alone could command absolute silence in a boardroom. A man whose decisions could shift markets. A man whose personal life was a fortress, sealed off, untouchable. And now, as Emma approached his office, she felt an odd tension hanging in the air, as though the entire building had collectively held its breath. She didn't think much of it. Stepping through the polished glass doors of the CEO's office, she was immediately met with an environment that was as controlled and pristine as the man himself. The space was modern, sleek, and meticulously organized, everything in its rightful place, with no room for chaos or unpredictability. The air was faintly scented with leather and expensive cologne, a subtle but unmistakable mark of power. Ryan Lancaster stood by his desk, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored white shirt. The morning light from the floor-to-ceiling windows cast sharp angles across his features, highlighting the chiseled precision of a man who looked like he had been sculpted rather than born. His expression was unreadable, detached, indifferent, as if nothing and no one could ever truly stir him. Emma placed the neatly folded ties onto the glass surface of his desk and straightened her posture. "I wasn't sure which color you preferred," she said with an easy smile. "So I brought them all." Silence. Ryan Lancaster did not look at her immediately. Instead, his gaze lingered on the ties, considering them with the same cold calculation he applied to stock portfolios and financial projections. For a moment, Emma wondered if he had even heard her. Then, finally, he exhaled sharply and spoke. "Pick one and hand it to me." The words were precise, measured, almost like an order rather than a request. Emma arched an eyebrow but didn't question it. Without much thought, she reached for a navy blue tie, the most neutral choice, the safest. She held it out to him, expecting him to take it and move on without further acknowledgement. But what happened next was something she never could have predicted. The moment their fingers touched, just the briefest brush of skin against skin, the air in the room changed. Ryan Lancaster stiffened instantly. His entire body recoiled as if she had sent a current of electricity through him. His back went rigid, his fingers twitched, and within the span of a heartbeat, he took a sharp step backward, nearly knocking into his chair. Emma barely had time to process what had just happened before she saw it, the look in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It wasn't annoyance. It was fear. "You just touched me." His voice was low, but it carried a sharpness that cut through the air like glass. Emma blinked, momentarily thrown. Yeah?" she said slowly, her hand still half extended, the tie hanging limply between her fingers. "I was just helping you." Ryan's jaw tightened. His breathing was controlled, but just barely. His gaze flicked to where her fingers had grazed his skin, as if he was trying to erase the moment from existence by sheer will alone. "Don't ever do that again." The words were clipped, tense, almost as if they had been forced through clenched teeth. Emma tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. Most people would have apologized, stepped back, and moved on without another word. Most people would have seen the reaction for what it was, a clear boundary, an unspoken rule not to be broken. But Emma wasn't most people. She had spent years observing human behavior, learning how to read the subtle micro-expressions that people tried to hide. And what she saw in Ryan Lancaster at that moment wasn't just discomfort, it wasn't just rigidity, it was something deeper, something raw. He had looked at her touch the way someone might look at an open flame, like it was dangerous, unpredictable, something he couldn't control. And yet, there was something else beneath the panic, a flicker of something he hadn't meant to show. He was afraid. But of what? Emma wasn't sure. What she did know, however, was that this wasn't the reaction of a man who simply disliked physical contact. This was the reaction of someone whose entire world had been built upon a foundation that could not afford to crack. And somehow, in the span of a single second, she had shaken it. The silence lingered long after the words had left his mouth. It was thick, oppressive, settling over the room like an invisible weight neither of them could shake off. Emma remained motionless, her gaze fixed on Ryan Lancaster. She had heard countless stories about him before she stepped foot in Horizon Capital. Stories of his sharp intellect, his ruthless business tactics, his unwavering control over every aspect of his life. But no one had ever mentioned this moment of vulnerability, this barely concealed panic that flashed across his features before he masked it behind a cold, impenetrable exterior. She had only touched him for a fraction of a second, and yet the effect was undeniable. Ryan stood rigid behind his desk, his breathing measured, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. His usual precision, the way he carried himself with unshakable confidence, was now slightly frayed at the edges. He had spent years crafting his image, ensuring that every interaction was calculated, every word was deliberate. He thrived in control, in predictability. Yet here he was, recoiling as if he had just been struck, his carefully constructed world knocked off balance by the simplest human contact. Emma watched as he exhaled slowly, deliberately. His jaw tightened, his gaze flickering to his hand, as if he could still feel the ghost of her touch lingering on his skin. For anyone else, this reaction might have been absurd, irrational. But Emma had always been observant. She saw the subtle things most people overlooked, the tension in his shoulders, the flicker of something unspoken in his eyes. She wasn't imagining it. This wasn't about some trivial preference or a mere dislike of physical touch. This was something much deeper. And yet, despite the momentary lapse, Ryan Lancaster did what he did best. He buried it. Within seconds, his expression hardened, his breathing evened out, and the mask of indifference slid back into place. He was no longer the man who had just flinched like a wounded animal. He was once again the CEO, the untouchable figure of power and control. Emma expected him to say something, to reprimand her, to assert his rule more forcefully. But instead he simply turned away, his movements deliberate, his attention shifting back to the work on his desk as if nothing had happened. The dismissal was clear. For most, it would have been enough to let it go, to step back, to forget the moment entirely and move forward as if the brief encounter had been meaningless. But Emma wasn't most people. She had spent years working in high-pressure environments, navigating the egos of powerful men. She knew when someone was genuinely angry and when they were trying to hide something. Ryan Lancaster wasn't just irritated, he was shaken. And the fact that a simple touch had done that to him? That was something worth noticing. As she turned to leave, she stole one last glance at him. He was back to his usual composed self, flipping through documents, making notes, fully immersed in the world he controlled. But she didn't miss the way his fingers flexed slightly, as if trying to rid themselves of the memory of contact. Emma knew one thing for certain. She had just stumbled onto something she wasn't supposed to see, and now she couldn't look away. The atmosphere in Horizon Capital subtly shifted after that fleeting moment of contact, though only Emma seemed to notice. Ryan Lancaster was a man of structure, of rigid boundaries that defined his world. But since that day, those boundaries had started to show hairline cracks, almost imperceptible but undeniably present. At first, it was his avoidance. Not the kind that was obvious. Ryan was too controlled for that. Instead, it was in the small things. The way he no longer lingered near her desk. The way his stride subtly changed to ensure they never walked side by side. The way his fingers tensed when she entered a room, as if bracing himself for an impact that never came. But avoidance was only part of it. Because even as he distanced himself, his presence loomed over her. Emma noticed his gaze, always fleeting, never lingering, yet undeniably there. Whenever she looked up from her desk, she would catch him watching. In meetings, his eyes would skim over the room, but for just a second too long, they would settle on her. It wasn't a stare of authority or impatience. It was something else entirely, something hesitant, something conflicted. And then there were the silent acts of assistance. Documents that should have taken hours to retrieve would mysteriously appear on her desk, arranged perfectly as if someone had taken the time to ensure she had what she needed. Minor scheduling conflicts would suddenly resolve themselves without her intervention. When she was overloaded with work, certain tasks would disappear from her plate, redirected, reassigned, removed. At first, she thought it was coincidence, but coincidences didn't have a pattern. She tested it once, deliberately leaving an unfinished report in the communal office printer, knowing it was something she was expected to finalize by morning. When she arrived the next day, the file was waiting on her desk, already completed. There was no note, no signature, but she knew. Ryan had done it. And yet, despite all of this, he kept his distance. Emma could feel it, a careful push and pull, like an invisible force tethering them while he desperately tried to sever the connection. But it was the frustration, the barely concealed irritation in his eyes, that confirmed what she already suspected. Ryan Lancaster, the untouchable, impenetrable force of Horizon Capital, was slipping. She saw it when she laughed too freely at a joke made by a male colleague, how his jaw tensed, his fingers curling slightly against the desk, as if resisting the urge to react. She saw it when another executive leaned in just a little too closely to explain a deal, how Ryan's entire body stiffened, his posture shifting as though preparing for battle. He never said anything, but silence could be just as loud as words. And then, without warning, he did something completely unexpected. An invitation. Not a casual request, not a professional obligation, but a decision made entirely by him. Ryan Lancaster, a man who controlled every aspect of his life with surgical precision, had willingly placed her beside him. A corporate charity gala, a night of formalities and business diplomacy, an event where every move was scrutinized, every interaction dissected. There was no logical reason for him to ask her. He had a sea of experienced assistants, public relations officers, executives who would gladly play the role of his +1 for the evening. But he had chosen her. And that was the first real crack in his carefully constructed armor. The gala was an event of opulence, of carefully curated appearances and calculated interactions. The ballroom shimmered under the glow of chandeliers, the air thick with murmured conversations and the delicate clinking of champagne flutes. It was a world of power and prestige, where every word was weighed and every movement held meaning. Emma blended into it effortlessly. She had chosen her dress carefully, a sleek, midnight blue gown that moved like liquid with every step she took. It wasn't ostentatious, but it held a quiet elegance that made heads turn. It was the kind of dress that commanded attention without demanding it, the kind that whispered confidence. And Ryan Lancaster noticed. From the moment she stepped into the venue, his composure wavered, though he masked it well. His eyes traced over her in a way that was almost imperceptible, a flicker of something unreadable flashing across his face before he turned away. But his silence was not indifference. It was restraint. As the night progressed, Emma found herself caught in the flow of introductions and conversations. The corporate world was a game, and she played it well, effortlessly weaving through discussions, exchanging pleasantries, holding her own. And then came Logan Pierce, a name that carried weight in the industry, a man of influence, known for his charm and effortless charisma. He was magnetic, the kind of person who could make anyone feel like the center of his attention. And for a few minutes, Emma was. Their conversation was easy, the kind that carried a natural rhythm. Logan's laughter was rich, his presence commanding yet welcoming. But it was the way he leaned in, the way his hand casually settled at her waist, a gesture so smooth, so practiced, that shifted everything. Because Ryan saw. And suddenly, the carefully maintained control that defined him shattered. It happened fast. One moment, Emma was laughing at something Logan had said, and the next, she felt a firm grasp on her wrist, pulling her away from the conversation. Ryan's presence was overwhelming, his body language coiled with tension. The intensity in his gaze was almost suffocating, something dark and possessive lurking beneath the surface. Emma barely had time to process the suddenness of it before his voice, low, unyielding, cut through the moment. "I don't like people touching you." It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a statement. It was a confession, a raw, unfiltered admission that bypassed logic and reason. Emma froze. This was Ryan Lancaster, the man who had spent years constructing walls so high they seemed impenetrable, the man who never faltered, never let emotion dictate his actions. And yet, here he was. Jealous. But jealousy wasn't the right word. This wasn't mere possessiveness or fleeting insecurity. This was deeper, something that had been simmering beneath the surface, unspoken until now. And then, before she could say anything, before she could even breathe, he kissed her. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't calculated. It was instinct, a moment of complete surrender. His hand found the curve of her jaw, his touch firm yet careful, as if grounding himself in the reality of her presence. The world around them ceased to exist. No murmuring voices, no watching eyes, just the undeniable electric pull between them. And in that moment, Emma realized something. Ryan Lancaster wasn't just afraid of touch. He was afraid of what it would mean. Because now, there was no turning back. The moment their lips parted, Ryan felt it. The crack in his carefully constructed world. It was as if years of discipline, of rigid control, had been undone in a single instant. He didn't speak. He didn't move. Emma's gaze lingered on him for just a second longer, searching for something. Confirmation, understanding, anything. But Ryan, paralyzed by the weight of what had just happened, gave her nothing. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the moment was gone. The next morning, Ryan was back in his office, his posture rigid, his demeanor colder than ever. The city skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but he saw none of it. His mind was elsewhere, replaying, dissecting, rationalizing. This was a mistake. It had to be. A momentary lapse in judgment, an impulse that should never have existed. So he did what he did best. He buried it. He avoided her. Days passed, each one a carefully orchestrated performance. Meetings were conducted with professional detachment. His words were clipped, his interactions mechanical. He convinced himself that if he just ignored it, ignored her, everything would reset. But it didn't. Because Emma wasn't like the others. She didn't cower under his indifference. She didn't retreat. If anything, she met his distance with an almost defiant calm, her presence an unshakable force in his world. And that was the problem. She was everywhere. In the quiet moments between meetings, when he caught the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the hallway, in the way the office seemed just a little too empty when she wasn't there, in the restless nights when his mind betrayed him, replaying that moment, her warmth, the way she had looked at him, as if he were something more than just a man defined by his rules. It was infuriating and terrifying, because for the first time in years, he felt something slipping through his fingers, something he wasn't sure he could afford to lose. Then came the email, a simple subject line. Resignation letter. Emma Sullivan. The moment he saw it, his body reacted before his mind could catch up. His grip tightened around the edge of his desk, breath halting, a cold weight settling in his chest. He read the words once. Then again. It didn't make sense. Emma was leaving. Just like that. Ryan stared at the screen, but the words blurred, drowned beneath the sudden, crushing realization. He had pushed her away. And now, she was gone. A sharp knock at the door jolted him, but he didn't respond. The world outside his office no longer existed. He had convinced himself he could live without her, that he could pretend nothing had changed. But now, faced with the reality of her absence, he saw the truth. Losing her wasn't just an inconvenience, it was unbearable. And for the first time in his life, Ryan Lancaster, the man who had spent years shutting out the world, felt fear. Real, unrelenting fear. Because if he let her walk away now, he knew he would never get her back. The office was a machine, polished, efficient, unyielding. Horizon Capital operated with precision, its employees moving in a synchronized rhythm of meetings, reports, and negotiations. But today, that rhythm was shattered. Because today, Ryan Lancaster, the man who never hesitated, never faltered, was about to do something completely out of character. The moment he stepped out of his office, a hush fell over the room. Conversations died mid-sentence. Phones were left ringing. Eyes turned, wide with disbelief, as the most disciplined CEO in the city walked straight towards one person. Emma. She stood by her desk, her back straight, her expression unreadable. Her resignation letter had already been sent. Her decision was made. But as she felt his presence approach, her fingers curled slightly at her sides, betraying the war inside her. Ryan's steps slowed as he reached her. And then, before the entire office, before his employees, his executives, his world, he did the unthinkable. He knelt. A murmur swept through the room, a collective gasp of disbelief. The cold, calculating CEO, who had spent years holding the world at arm's length, was now on one knee, his usually steady hands trembling slightly. His eyes found hers, no longer the guarded, unreadable gaze of a man who controlled everything. Instead, There was something raw there, something unspoken. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. And then, finally, he spoke. The words came out uneven, as if they had been locked inside him for too long. He had been a fool. He had been terrified, not of failure, not of losing control, but of losing her. And in his attempt to push her away, he had done exactly what he feared most. He had hurt her. Emma inhaled sharply, her arms crossing in front of her chest, a flicker of something unreadable in her expression. For the first time, Ryan Lancaster wasn't the one in control. She could say no. She could walk away. But she didn't. Instead, a slow, knowing smile played at the corners of her lips. She wasn't going to make this easy for him. Ryan's smirk returned, just a ghost of it, the confidence of a man who had spent years winning every battle. But this wasn't about winning. It never had been. This was about proving that for once in his life, he was willing to fight for something more than just success. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was teasing, but there was warmth beneath it. Did he really think kneeling was enough? His response was immediate. But he was ready to spend the rest of his life proving otherwise. And just like that, the unshakable, untouchable Ryan Lancaster finally found the one thing he never knew he was missing: love. The office erupted into a stunned silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The CEO, Horizon Capital's unyielding force, the man known for his ironclad discipline, was still on one knee, waiting. The weight of his words lingered in the air, the confession raw and unguarded. Emma held his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had prepared herself to walk away, to start anew, but now he was making it impossible. Ryan Lancaster, the man who had built walls higher than anyone she had ever known, was tearing them down, brick by brick, in front of everyone. His vulnerability was staggering. Her fingers twitched at her sides, resisting the instinct to reach for him. For the first time, she saw him not as the untouchable CEO, not as the enigma she had spent months trying to decipher, but as a man. A man who was afraid, who had been lost in his own rules for too long, and who had finally found something worth breaking them for. A slow, knowing smile curled on her lips. The tension in the room was suffocating, but Emma let it stretch, savoring the moment. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "All right, Mr. Millionaire." A collective exhale rippled through the office as quiet gasps and murmurs filled the space. But Ryan wasn't paying attention to them. His focus remained locked on Emma, his entire world condensed into the curve of her smile and the flicker of warmth in her eyes. Emma stepped forward and extended a hand toward him. "You still owe me dinner," she added, her voice light, teasing. But beneath it, there was something more. Relief washed over Ryan like a wave, his shoulders visibly relaxing as a slow smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. He took her hand, rising to his feet, his grip firm yet reverent, no longer held back by invisible restraints, no longer shackled by a rule that had defined him for so long. The entire office burst into scattered applause, hushed whispers of disbelief mixing with knowing smiles. Employees exchanged glances, some in awe, some with satisfaction. The ice had finally cracked. Ryan, however, ignored them all. His world had narrowed to just one person. As they stood there, in the center of the office that had once been his entire life, he realized something. For the first time in 20 years, he wasn't afraid. For the first time in 20 years, he had touched something, someone, without feeling like he was breaking. And for the first time in his life, Ryan Lancaster knew what it felt like to truly hold on to something worth keeping. This wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of something neither of them had ever expected,